It began, as evil often does, in silence. In January 1974, a quiet morning in Wichita, Kansas, was torn apart by a sound that would haunt the city for decades, a scream that died before it could reach the street. Inside a modest suburban home, the Otero family lay bound and lifeless. A husband, a wife, 2 children, each with precision, each posed with a disturbing care that spoke of control, ritual, and something far darker than rage. Police had no suspect, no motive, no sense of what kind of man could destroy a family so completely, and then vanish as if into the wind. For months, Wichita lived in fear, but what no one knew then was that the killer was still there. He was among them, driving past the crime scene on his way to work, sitting quietly in church pews, nodding politely to his neighbors. His name was Dennis Rader, a husband, a father, a city employee. To everyone around him, he was reliable, meticulous, maybe a little odd, but harmless. They had no idea that when he looked at them, he wasn't seeing people, he was seeing potential victims, stories to be written in blood and rope. Rader craved recognition as much as he craved control. He needed the world to know him, to fear him, to whisper his name. But the name he gave himself wasn't Dennis. It was something that defined his every impulse. 3 words that captured the ritual he performed over and over, each time perfecting his method: bind, torture, kill. And with every letter he sent to the police, every taunting word carefully chosen, he reminded them and himself that he was still out there, watching, waiting, and enjoying their helplessness. No one could imagine that the man they saw leading prayers on Sunday was the same one who tied knots in the dark. No one wanted to believe that the face of evil could smile so easily, speak so softly, and live so close. Sometimes, the most terrifying monsters don't hide in shadows. They hide behind routine, inside the man who waves at you every morning. Before the headlines, before the fear, Dennis Rader lived a life so ordinary it was almost invisible. Born in 1,945 inches Pittsburgh, Kansas, he grew up in a small, devoutly religious family that valued discipline, respect, and quiet obedience. His childhood was not one of chaos or abuse. It was neat, structured, too structured perhaps. From an early age, he discovered a fascination that he would never outgrow: the power of control. While other boys imagined heroes, Dennis imagined scenarios where he held life and death in his hands. As an adult, that obsession hid beneath layers of normalcy. Rader served in the Air Force, married his college sweetheart Paula, and eventually settled in the suburban calm of Park City, just outside Wichita. He became the kind of man people trusted instinctively. He worked as a compliance officer for the city, a job that allowed him to enforce rules, issue warnings, and maintain order. He was exacting about his lawn, punctual at work, and unfailingly polite to neighbors. The kind of man who'd stop to help you change a tire, who'd attend your church picnic, and remember your children's names. Every Sunday, he sat in the same pew at Christ Lutheran Church, leading the congregation in prayer, his voice steady and sincere. He volunteered as the president of the church council. He took photographs of his family, documented every moment of their lives. The image he built was that of a man whose world revolved around family, faith, and responsibility. But beneath that polished surface was a private world no one saw, one of lists, sketches, and fantasies. Rader kept meticulous journals filled with notes about potential victims, their routines, their homes. He wrote about projects instead of people, reducing human beings to targets of his private theater. He planned, watched, waited. The smallest details, a woman's window left open, a light still on after midnight, could set his imagination spinning. In those moments, his calm smile hid something electric, almost euphoric: power, control, domination. To him, it wasn't about hate, it was about fulfillment, about turning imagination into reality. While neighbors praised his dedication, his wife admired his reliability, and his children adored their father, Dennis Rader's other life was already taking form. It was patient, methodical, invisible, a life that lived in notebooks and dark corners of his mind, waiting for the day it would come alive. No one in Park City could have imagined that the man who trimmed their hedges and led their prayers was also rehearsing how to bind, how to suffocate, how to kill. And as the Kansas winds blew through the quiet streets, no one noticed that behind one set of closed curtains, a man was smiling to himself because he finally knew what he was destined to do. The 15th of January, 1974. It was a cold Kansas morning. quiet and windless. The kind of day that makes small towns feel completely safe. Inside a modest house on Edgemore Street, the Otero family, Joseph, Julie, and their 2 children, Josephine and Joseph Jr., were starting their morning routine. By noon, they would all be dead. Dennis Rader had been watching them for weeks. He called it scoping, studying their schedule, mapping their routines, and waiting for the moment when the father would leave for work. But that morning, something went wrong. Joseph Sr. stayed home. Rader almost aborted the plan. Almost. Instead, he adjusted. He entered the home wearing gloves and a mask, holding a .22 handgun, pretending it was a simple robbery. But what he wanted wasn't money. It was control. Inside, he moved with the precision of someone acting out a script he had written long before. He took their hands, their feet, even their faces, speaking calmly, almost apologetically. But his eyes stayed cold. One by one, he their air. He struck the parents first, then the son. And then, alone with 11-year-old Josephine, he paused, savoring the silence. Minutes later, she was gone too, left in the basement, posed like an object of worship. When Rader walked out, he didn't run. He closed the door behind him, drove home, and ate lunch. To anyone who saw him that day, he was just another man finishing his errands. But inside his head, something irreversible had begun. The fantasy had become real. The discovery shocked Wichita. 4 innocent people in their home: the father, a former Air Force pilot; the mother, a kind homemaker; 2 bright children. The brutality didn't make sense. There was no forced entry, no theft, no motive. The killer seemed to have vanished into thin air, leaving only a set of meticulous bindings and footprints that led nowhere. For months, investigators chased shadows. Rumors spread about satanic cults, revenge killings, serial murderers. But nothing connected. The city lived in quiet panic. Women double-locked their doors, men checked their basements twice before sleeping. Wichita was no longer safe. And Rader, in the privacy of his home, watched the news coverage with satisfaction. The city's fear thrilled him. It meant he mattered. He began clipping newspaper articles, saving them in folders marked projects. He wrote letters to himself about the experience, reliving every detail, refining the story until it became legend his legend. A year later, he killed again. And again. Each murder more calculated, more controlled, as if he were perfecting an art. But no one knew who he was or that he was watching their every move. By 1977, the police received their first letter. Typed, deliberate, taunting. The author claimed responsibility for multiple murders. He described the scenes in chilling detail, information never made public, and at the bottom of the page, a name appeared for the first time. BTK, bind, torture, kill. The city had a name now, but they still didn't have a face. By the late 1970 seconds, Wichita was a city under siege not by war, but by uncertainty. The man who called himself BTK was no longer just a rumor. He was a presence, an invisible figure who haunted news headlines and nightly prayers alike. Mothers refused to let their daughters walk alone. Locksmiths worked overtime. Police tip lines rang endlessly with false sightings. But the killer was never far. He was at neighborhood barbecues, sitting in church, smiling politely as detectives passed him on the street. Each new letter from BTK arrived like a knife through the city's fragile sense of safety. He wrote to the Wichita Eagle, to the police, even to television stations, always demanding recognition, always craving the same thing, acknowledgement. "How many do I have to kill," he once typed, "before I get a name in the paper or some national recognition?" Inside the police department, investigators were unraveling under the weight of frustration. The task force grew to hundreds of officers, but BTK always seemed one step ahead. Every time they thought they had a lead, a shoe print, a strand of hair, a vehicle, it dissolved into nothing. The killer taunted them through rhymes and coded messages, even comparing himself to Jack the Ripper. "They will never catch me," he bragged. "I am a ghost." And for a while, he was. After 1991, the killing stopped. No letters, no clues, no BTK. The city began to exhale again, slowly convincing itself that maybe he had died, moved away, or been arrested for another crime. The case grew cold, fading into Wichita's uneasy folklore. But Dennis Rader hadn't disappeared. He had simply gone dormant. His life continued as if nothing had ever happened. He raised his children, worked his city job, and rose to leadership in his church. He wrote reports about neighbors' unkempt lawns, attended town meetings, and played the role of a man who had mastered normalcy. The monster had learned patience. Privately, he still collected trophies from his victims: photographs, clothing, even personal belongings hidden inside his home. He revisited crime scenes in his memory, reliving the power, the control, the quiet thrill of it all. The fantasies never left. They simply waited for a spark to bring them back to life. That spark came in 2004, 30 years after the Otero murders. BTK, unable to bear being forgotten, reached out again. He mailed a new letter to a local television station, claiming responsibility for unsolved crimes and asking if detectives still remembered him. He signed it as always, "Yours truly, BTK." It was the same arrogance that had defined his life, the belief that he could outsmart everyone, that he could control the narrative. But this time, the world had changed. Technology had changed. And the man who prided himself on control was about to lose it all. By 2004, Dennis Rader had grown restless. The city had forgotten his name, and that insult burned deeper than any punishment could. For 30 years, he had lived in the shadows of his own legend. He wanted attention again, but this time, his arrogance would destroy him. Rader began communicating with police under his infamous signature, BTK. His letters were careful but proud, typed neatly, accompanied by puzzles, drawings, and even souvenirs from old crime scenes. The task force, long dormant, was revived. Detectives pored over every word, every punctuation mark, searching for the slightest mistake. And then, the killer made one. In February 2005, BTK sent a floppy disk to a Wichita television station, asking them to forward it to police. The message came with a question, typed in his usual mechanical tone: "Can a floppy disk be traced back to me?" Detectives, posing as journalists, assured him it was safe. It wasn't. When forensic analysts examined the disk, they found hidden metadata. The document had been last modified by a user named Dennis at Christ Lutheran Church. A quick search revealed that Dennis Rader was the president of the church council, a respected family man and city compliance officer, the quiet neighbor who lived just blocks from many of the victims. Police began surveillance. They followed him for days, noting his routine, his grocery runs, his office hours, his stops at the post office. To confirm their suspicions, detectives obtained a DNA sample from Rader's daughter's medical record. It was a perfect match to the DNA found on BTK's victims decades earlier. On the 25th of February 2005, as Dennis Rader drove home for lunch, police surrounded his vehicle. "Mr. Rader," an officer said calmly, "do you know why you're being arrested?" Rader looked at them without panic, almost relieved, and replied, "Oh, I have suspicions." At the station, he didn't resist. He didn't cry or deny. Instead, he began talking for hours, in chilling detail, recounting each murder like he was describing routine maintenance. He called his victims projects, his hits. He spoke of his Factor X, a dark force that he claimed compelled him to kill. There was no remorse, only pride in precision. When his trial began in June 2005, the courtroom was silent. Survivors and family members of victims wept as Rader stood before them, adjusting his glasses, recounting each crime step by step, the bindings, the photographs, the aftermath. The judge asked if he understood the charges. Rader nodded and said, "Yes, sir, I committed those murders. 10 counts of first-degree murder, 10 life sentences, no parole." As he was led away, the man who had spent 3 decades playing God finally met a system he couldn't control. His mask, the church leader, the father, the citizen, was gone, leaving only the hollow man beneath. But the silence that followed his conviction was not peace. It was the sound of a city realizing that evil had lived among them, had smiled, and had shaken their hands. When the courtroom emptied and the reporters packed away their cameras, the story of Dennis Rader did not end. It simply changed shape. Behind the steel doors of El Dorado Correctional Facility, the man once known as BTK returned to what he always craved most: control. This time over the story itself. He spent hours writing letters, detailing his thoughts, his fantasies, the things he believed made him special. But the world no longer listened with fascination. They listened with horror. In interviews and psychological evaluations, Rader spoke of his crimes as if describing someone else, the other me, he called it, a shadow self who could plan murders between Sunday services and family dinners. Psychologists called it compartmentalization. To him, it was art. Even in chains, he tried to craft his own mythology. but the only audience left was the echo of what he had done. The families of his victims never truly healed. Some found solace in his capture, others felt only emptiness. For years they had prayed for answers, for closure. What they received was the voice of a man who killed without reason, who spoke without empathy. The wounds he left were deeper than any sentence could reach. Wichita changed too. The city that once lived in quiet fear now lived with memory. For decades, people had wondered if the monster next door was real. Now they knew he had been real, and he had mowed his lawn every Saturday morning. The church he once led still stands, but its walls carry an invisible scar. Rader remains alive today, serving 10 consecutive life sentences. He spends his days cataloging, writing, and trying to assert meaning over the chaos he created. But for all his meticulous planning, for all the decades he spent chasing attention, Dennis Rader will be remembered not for his control, but for his emptiness. Evil in his case was not wild or impulsive. It was patient, it was organized, it was polite. And that is what makes it terrifying that a man could so carefully design his mask, and the world would help him wear it. Because the truth about monsters is that they rarely come with horns or claws. They come dressed as neighbors, fathers, and friends. And sometimes, the most chilling sound in the world is not the scream of a victim, but the silence that follows when the monster next door quietly closes his door for the night.